the Journal would not have run this story unless they were absolutely rock solid that this drawing is legitimate. And I know that Donald Trump lied immediately, that he doesn't write pictures. In fact, you can go to New York charity auctions. You can go to certain New York homes and you can see Donald Trump's doodles.
Donald Trump, as you may have heard, suing, of course, for libel and for slander over claims he sent the sex offender Jeffrey Epstein this lewd letter and a sketch of a naked woman. He has denied that. He says that letter is fake. But I'm wondering how this is playing in the US right now. Let's bring in Professor Scott Lucas, Professor of American Politics at the University College Dublin, editor as well of EA World View, a site on US politics and foreign policy. Very good morning to you, Scott. What is going on then politically in the US after this sort of debacle and this reporting that Donald Trump has denied is true?
Well, I think you can start with the rift which this has caused within the Trumpist camp, especially those who have embedded themselves in conspiracy theories for so many years. Going back to the start, in fact, of Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, Trump had played upon the idea that Epstein had these files that implicated Democrats, that implicated his political opponents. He played upon the idea that this was connected to wider conspiracy theories, such as the Pizzagate hoax, that Democrats were involved in pedophilia. He did that when he was in power. He did it when he was in opposition. He did it when he got back into the White House. As late as February, his attorney general was saying the Epstein files were on her desk. But at the end of the day, it was put up or shut up. That many people who were really entrenched, that they just are tied into this belief that these conspiracy theories are true. They wanted to see the evidence. And when he couldn't produce it, it caused this discontent. Now, for the moment, he's trying to buy time with two things. One is he's making a very limited declaration that he says, all right, we'll get grand jury transcripts released. Well, that's up to judges to release grand jury transcripts, and that's only a small fraction of the Epstein material. Secondly, he's playing shoot the messenger with this threat, to sue the Wall Street Journal for $10 billion. I personally think that the Journal would not have run this story unless they were absolutely rock solid that this drawing is legitimate. And I know that Donald Trump lied immediately, that he doesn't write pictures. In fact, you can go to New York charity auctions. You can go to certain New York homes and you can see Donald Trump's doodles. So, but the point of this is it tries to tie up his believers in the idea of, it must be the fake news media. But I'll close with this, as important as it may be, and we can discuss Epstein further. I think there are even bigger issues out there. I think the U.S. economy is going to be the key one that determines Trump's political future. And the signs there are not good, especially amongst his tariff debacle.
Yeah, and this is it. But I suppose the Epstein issue is particularly interesting because of how it plays to his base. And Donald Trump's normal way of responding to things that he doesn't like being said about him, true or not, is deny, but then is to go, fake news, blah, blah, blah. That works normally with his base. Do you think it will work this time, given how entrenched people are, as you say?
I think we're in the middle of finding that out, and I wouldn't want to predict it, given how unpredictable Trump is, given how unpredictable U.S. politics is. It could well be that the conspiracy theorists forgive him. It could well be that those who are really invested in the Epstein story give him a pass. But I think this one is different from what we've seen. Trump's tactics, the dead cat tactics to always shift to another issue, the idea that his enemies are out to get him, that it's all just a witch hunt. It worked over his ties with Russia, which were very much true and not a hoax. It worked over, for example, his blackmail of Ukraine, trying to cut off military aid to them all the way back in 2019. It worked even when he instigated that coup attempt in 2021 with the Capitol attack, because people still wanted to believe, look, I'm part of the MAGA movement. But he was playing upon their enemies as well. Here he's not. He was on their side, and now he isn't. now he is actually insulting them and saying that they are weak for believing in the Epstein files. And it's one thing to follow your dear leader when he attacks other people. It's another to follow your dear leader when he's attacking you.
I will say this. Where are the Democrats on all this? How are they capitalizing? Because as far as I'm aware, they're just pretty silent on most things these days. You would have thought that this would be a real issue that they could really get behind. And I know that they are saying some things and they are calling for some things and the release of more information. But surely this is their opportunity, isn't it, to reach out to those people now that are starting to question their loyalty to Donald Trump?
Well, the Democrats have been vocal on this. I mean, the Democrats came out when this flared up a couple of weeks ago, and they said, let's see the files. There's no excuse not to release the material that the Attorney General Pam Bondi said was on her desk. They've repeated that. They have not been shy. The media is not paying attention to the Democrats.
That's more the issue, isn't it? I wonder. The Democrats might be making noises, but is it getting through?
Yeah, Trump is he's still the story that sells. I mean, this goes back to 2016 when CBS, which completely capitulated to Trump on another issue in the past week, the head of CBS, Les Moonves, says, oh, well, he's good for our ratings. This is why we run the stories. And 9 years later, that's still the case. But I do think there's an element here also of that when the other side is in trouble, when the other side is tearing itself apart, you don't get out in front of them. You don't get out and make yourself the target here, especially given that, Democrats have been the target of this conspiracy theory for so many years. So you make your position well known, but you allow Donald Trump in a way to sort of twist in the wind and to try to spin and to try to extricate for himself for this, while also presenting yourself as the reliable party on other issues, which takes me back not only to the economy, but immigration, where Donald Trump, and this is a huge story that's not picking up traction, is sinking in the opinion polls over his approach to immigration. Not necessarily, I think, with his base, but with a number of folks who voted for him, but now are quite disenchanted with the idea that it's deportation first, it's the denial of rights first, and then we'll talk about the serious issue around migration and refugees.
Yeah, it's all fascinating stuff, and it all sort of feeds into each other, doesn't it, all of this? Professor Scott Lucas, thank you, as always, for your thoughts on everything happening in the US at the moment.
Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It's Monday, the 21st of July in London. I'm Caroline Hepker. Coming up today, the EU plans its tariff response as the prospect of a US trade deal begins to dim. The London Stock Exchange reportedly considers options to allow 24-hour trading. Plus, suffering from self-inflicted injuries, Elon Musk's empire creaks under the strain of his ongoing antics. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. Bloomberg understands that EU officials will meet in the coming days to discuss how to respond to a possible no-deal trade scenario with President Trump. The move comes as the US is said to be seeking tariffs on EU goods higher than 10%, with limited exceptions. However, speaking to CBS's Face the Nation, the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said that negotiations were going well.
I am confident we'll get a deal done, okay? And it will be great for America because the president has the back of America. So I think all these key countries will figure out it is better to open their markets to the United States of America than to pay a significant tariff.
Secretary Lutnick speaking there as EU states consider activating the bloc's most powerful trade tool, the so-called anti-coercion instrument, in the event of no deal ahead of the 1st of August deadline. The ACI would grant officials broad powers to take retaliatory action, including new taxes on US tech giants and restrictions on US investments in the EU. Now, the lack of sustained progress on a US-EU trade deal comes as Bloomberg Economics calculates the likely impact of tariffs, which are now at their highest rate since 1939. With more, here's Bloomberg's Chris Pitt.
With the average US levy on overseas goods exceeding 13%, Bloomberg Economics projects that President Trump's global trade war will likely result in a $2 trillion hit to global GDP by the end of 2027. China accounts for about half the downgrade, with the country's growth now forecast to be just 4.4% next year. Bloomberg Economics has also lowered its 2025 US GDP forecast to 1.5%, down from 2.1% in December. Meanwhile, the UK is expected to continue posting sluggish growth, with GDP projected to rise by just 1.2% this year and 1.1% next year. In London, Chris Pitt, Bloomberg Radio.
Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba says that he intends to stay on despite his ruling coalition suffering a historic setback in Sunday's upper house election. Japanese public broadcaster NHK reports that the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, along with its longtime partner, the Komeito Party, failed to retain a majority in the upper house. Eurasia Group's director of Japan and Asia Trade, David Bowling, says that the results follow a broader trend at the ballot box.
The big message from this election has been, inflation, and it kills incumbents. And we saw that happen in last October in the election, and this is sort of the second punch that Ishiba has taken. I think it's very hard. He was already on shaky ground. He's even on more shaky ground to remain as prime minister.
David Bowling of Eurasia Group speaking there as traders grow increasingly concerned that further weakening of Ishiba's leadership could push the coalition to make concessions to the opposition, including cuts to the sales tax. Investor scepticism over lawmakers' ability to rein in spending is one factor helping to drive yields on Japanese debt to their highest levels in more than 2 decades. Reports suggest that the London Stock Exchange is considering the introduction of 24-hour trading in response to growing demand from retail investors. According to the Financial Times, LSE Group is examining the practicalities of the move, including the technology and regulatory implications. The development comes as exchanges around the world consider expanding their trading windows, driven by a surge in individual investors trading via smartphones. The New York Stock Exchange, the Nasdaq and the CBOE global markets have all applied in recent months to extend their trading hours. Here in the UK, home sellers are slashing prices at a record pace. That's according to new data from Rightmove, which says that the market is responding to high supply and buyer discernment. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
A decade-high number of properties for sale has tipped the scale in favour of buyers in some of the UK's most expensive areas. The average asking price dropped 1.2% to just over £373,000 this month, the biggest drop ever seen during a July, according to Rightmove. It's a trend that chimes with recent industry data, which points to home prices cooling since a tax cut for buyers expired in April. The shift comes as mortgage rates are also edging down. Data from Moneyfacts shows that the average 2-year fixed mortgage rate has fallen since the start of the year. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
So that's the housing market. Now to some sports news. World number 1 golfer Scottie Scheffler says he has worked his whole life to lift the claret jug after winning the Open in imperious fashion. The American clinched a 4-shot victory, finishing 17 under par at Royal Portrush. Scheffler is now just one major title away from completing a so-called career Grand Slam. But he says that isn't on his radar.
It would obviously be very cool, but that's not what motivates me at the end of the day. I'm just trying to get the most out of myself, and looking forward to the challenge of continuing to play professional golf. And every week is different. And this week I was the best player, but the beauty is we got to tee it up in Memphis again in a couple of weeks, and we start all over back at even par.
Scheffler achieved his second major victory of the year as the home crowd favourite Rory McIlroy had to settle for a share of 7th place at 10 under par, 1 stroke behind England's Matt Fitzpatrick. So that is a roundup of our top news stories this morning. In terms of the markets, so the Japanese yen had strengthened as much as 0.7%. It's now up about 0.3%. That's the main reaction to Sunday's election in Japan, because the markets more broadly are closed in Japan for a holiday. So there's also no cash. The Treasury is trading in Asian hours. In terms of stock futures this morning, you've got US stock futures positive up about 0.1% for the S&P 500. US stocks 50 futures, though, are down 0.25% in a very important week full of data, an ECB rate decision this week in Europe. Ryanair's first quarter profit also coming in as a beat, 820 million euros. And then looking at the euro this morning, trading also slightly firmer against a weaker dollar at 116.32. So those are the main data points in the markets. In a moment, we're going to bring you the latest on the EU's potential tariff retaliatory package, the plan being worked on, and our deep dive reporting around Elon Musk and his businesses who are still suffering fallout from the brief unity between Musk and Trump that, of course, has broken down recently. So we'll get into that in a moment, but there's also another story that caught my attention this morning. Like all the best IPs, intellectual property in full, Alien is now an entertainment franchise, and with it comes last year's Alien Romulus, and in the next few weeks a new series from FX called Alien Earth. Bloomberg Businessweek's Esther Zuckerman has been writing about this because she got to speak to the series creator Noah Hawley. Fantastic interview. I love how she points out that it's not the giant drooling parasitic monsters in the movie that are the real villains. The Fiend is the faceless conglomerate, the company pulling the strings. And so in this new series, which apparently might actually stretch to multiple season, the action is when billionaires become trillionaires. They have more power than governments, and it's about 5 corporations battling it out for power. Hawley wanted to consider what happens when you take the aliens out of Alien. I'm really hoping that this season does what the best entertainment does these days, which is build worlds that please the new audience, but also please the die-hard fans, so they kind of weave old stories and lore into new creations. In short, I'm hoping for tough characters, some alien hunting, no gore, and maybe a new kind of mech. We'll have to see. Anyway, it's one story that I was thinking about today, what's coming your way in terms of entertainment. I'm going to put a link in our show notes to that story if you're an Alien fan like me. Right, let's think about what's happening here in the EU. What is going to happen if the European Union doesn't secure a negotiated deal with President Trump over tariffs? EU envoys are meeting to further their response plan. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Chancellor Friedrich Merz is also hosting an investment summit with dozens of companies who are expected to pledge hundreds of billions of euros of investment tied to certain government reforms. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Berlin. Good morning, Ollie. Negotiations between Brussels and Washington expected to continue for the next couple of weeks. What level and scope of tariffs, though, is the US now looking at?
Yeah, well, that's a question I think everybody would like the answer to, not least of whom the negotiators on the European side, because I think at this stage they really still don't entirely know what the United States is going to do and what is in Donald Trump's mind 2 weeks from now. Remember, the deadline that is coming up is August the 1st. That is the Friday after next, and that is when you get 30% tariffs, theoretically, that kick in on all EU goods. And remember, this is super important for everybody because this is the biggest trading relationship in the world between the United States and the EU. It's more than $1 trillion worth of trade that goes in both directions. And I think the frustration so far, I mean, certainly from a journalistic standpoint, is there has not been a lot of clarity on where they are in negotiations. There have been, of course, lots of different levels of talks to try to get to 0% tariffs for 0% tariffs. That is an idea that is basically dead in the water. We know that basically the United States is setting a minimum rate of 10%. For the Europeans, the question is how much more pain than that are they willing to accept? How much asymmetry are they willing to accept in their discussions with Trump? But at the end of the day, I think the frustration from the European side is whatever the sort of discussions are leading up to this, at the end of the day, it's going to depend somewhat on how Trump feels on the day and feels closer to those negotiations, how strong he feels his hand is, but in part due to the other negotiations that are going on. And so I think it's very difficult, and there's a lot of anxiety. You know, I spent the weekend at the G20 at the end of last week talking to all these finance ministers, and I think there is a dawning realization that kind of the most optimistic scenarios